brain has been compromised, usurped, changed, whatever. You're a different person once you've been addicted.
The last 2 years of my crystal use, it got worse and worse and worse, and I knew I was in deep trouble. And I'd be up for the second or third night in a row, and I'd be in my apartment, and I'd be sure that there was somebody outside the door. I'd be peeking out from behind the curtains trying to catch them. I knew about this paranoia that happens sometimes when you're a crystal addict. I knew it was there, but I couldn't stop it.
My mind told me to get on a window ledge. Well, I fell 4 stories down in a brownstone in Brooklyn and almost died.
I let everything around me collapse. You know, my house went into foreclosure. I lost my car. I kept my phone bill paid, but I had to have a connection to my dealer. And I'm losing my job. That's always the last thing you lose is your job, because that's the support you're having. I realized I didn't have any control. I realized no matter how much I wanted to quit, I couldn't. And it was the most fear I've ever felt in my life.
What we're talking about is there being in a state where the drug has totally taken over their being. What that means clinically is that they're in a condition where they suffer from compulsive, uncontrollable drug seeking and use. People are able to understand this now when they think about schizophrenic people who act in very bizarre ways. Why are they acting bizarrely? Well, there's something wrong with their brain. That's exactly what's happening in addiction. Something has changed in the brain.
You don't know you're falling in love with it. You don't know that it's beginning to take a priority. Except for one day you wake up and you know you gotta have it because you can't function.
Literally what happens is that you take the drug for a prolonged period of time and it changes the biochemical processing in the brain. You stop taking the drug and that change persists. For example, with methamphetamine we know that chronic use of methamphetamine reduces the ability to produce dopamine while you're taking methamphetamine for a long period of time. Then you stop taking methamphetamine and you still are less able to produce dopamine 4 weeks later, 6 months later, a year later. We believe, we haven't proven this yet, but we believe that then results in an inability to experience pleasure in a normal way.
So you go back to the drug again and again just to feel normal, to feel right.
Absolutely. So what happens with crack cocaine is that you take cocaine initially to elevate dopamine, and then after you use it repeatedly, dopamine levels go down, and then the person feels terrible.
In the beginning, it was absolutely pleasurable. It was exciting. It was erotic. You know, I really looked forward to it. I loved to get high. At some point, though, it was no longer exciting. It was just the way I was. I just did it to function. I did it to get out of bed. I did it to go to work. It was just the way I lived.
Drugs as a way of life become a vicious cycle. Chronic use creates the brain's need for more. Dopamine surges, then subsides. Pleasure gives way to pain, until use and abuse spiral into addiction. To penetrate this puzzling and powerful vortex of drug addiction has taken some extraordinary detective work. Sherlock Holmes meet George Koob. At the Scripps Research Institute in La Jolla, California, Koob is investigating the common essence of all drug addictions, whether the substance is alcohol, nicotine, cocaine, amphetamine, heroin, or marijuana.
Tony is preparing these probes for an experiment where
Koob and his colleagues are studying rodents to understand how prolonged and plentiful drug use depletes dopamine.
This goes right into the brain of the rodent.
And how it affects other neurotransmitters.
This is a very, very sensitive technique for measuring neurotransmitters.
What looks to the layman like a satellite photograph of Hawaii is actually the neural landscape of a rat's brain. Coop's team has identified where the dopamine is released, an important part of understanding how, during addiction, the brain's reward system triggers a roller coaster of emotion.
As you can see in this diagram here, the work has focused in on an area called the nucleus accumbens, which is up here in the basal forebrain, but also on an area called the central nucleus, the amygdala.
If you published this as a map, would right here be the pleasure center of the brain, the sort of Times Square or Disney World?
Not so much a pleasure center, but a pleasure circuit. This is the circuit of the brain that we believe is important for guiding our everyday life.
To do the things we have to do, like eating to survive, sex to procreate.
Yeah. And what we're discovering is that drugs of abuse basically usurp this circuitry. They take it over. In other words, you no longer seek out natural pleasures because the drug is driving the system. Our bodies are built, in my view, to experience a certain amount of pleasure.
A certain amount of pleasure, to be sure, but in everyday life, most of us don't go off the deep end with pleasure. Our appetites for food, for sex, are governed.
So the issue is that something regulates that. Why aren't we copulating all the time? Why aren't we always overeating? Why aren't we overindulging in any of these things that we need to survive as a species?
So there's something in the original blueprint that seeks pleasure and at the same time regulates the pleasure I'm having.
In a sense, there is some kind of control mechanism. It's similar, in my view, similar to that regulates body temperature. Basically, I think we have so much money in the bank in terms of pleasure in our lives, and we can expend that money over the course of a weekend in binging on cocaine, or we can expend it over a 2-week period in the normal pleasures of everyday life. But if you expend this pleasure neurochemicals in one go, sort of such as a binge of drug addiction, then one pays for it. The system has to self-regulate. The system has to re-regulate and return to homeostasis.
What do you do for pleasure?
My favorite occupation when I'm not doing science is that I grow fruit trees, blackberries, and peaches.
Coop's curiosity leads him to look at how artificial pleasure created by drugs differs from natural pleasures.
I mean, it's hard to make equivalent a 30-minute cocaine binge with my gardening, but if I were to do that, I would think that the pleasure that is derived under each circumstance could be more or less the same. It's just condensed over time, and that, of course, explains why cocaine is such an unbelievably powerful reinforcing stimulus.
It gets there very quickly.
It gets there very quickly, and it activates those dopamine neurons much more quickly, presumably, than natural stimuli would do.
Coop believes the speed and intensity with which addictive drugs work in our brains uses up our dopamine supply. No more dopamine, no more pleasure.
So your brain's reward system is depleted. You get no pleasure from anything except drugs, and even the drugs don't do it anymore. So you have depleted the system. You're out of money in the bank.
It's not only that dopamine is depleted by chronic drug use, other neurotransmitters are affected as well. Coop has recently discovered a neurotransmitter that jumpstarts the body's stress system after plentiful drug taking. To relieve the stress, the addict wants more.
And so alcoholics will report that they are drinking to reduce stress, when in fact the alcohol is producing more and more and more stress in them. And so then they start drinking to reduce the stress that the alcohol produced, and you get into this vicious cycle that we were talking about earlier.
2 feels good, so 3 is going to feel better, and then 4 will feel better. More is always better. That's the addict mind. More is always better.
And so one of our passions right now, one of our major interests, for which we don't have a lot of the answers yet, but it's not only us, but many other laboratories across the country, are trying to understand how this cycle then translates into vulnerability to future relapses and future drug addiction. And that's pretty much where the action is. What we need to do is understand how this sequence of events leads to a vulnerability to relapse. And why do people go back? 80% of individuals who detoxify within a year go back to drug-seeking behavior and relapse.
Have you ever had a relapse?
Yes, I did. I relapsed after being in the program for 7 years.
I was cleaning my house, and I found this little yellow box that I used to stash my drugs. And before I knew it, I'd taken it. And it absolutely scared the hell out of me. I mean, I could not believe from where I'd been that I would relapse.
Slick, start talking. Slick is that little voice. That's what we give it a name. Slick. I'm powerless over Slick. You know what I mean?
Slick smarter than you?
Slick is very smart, Bill. I mean, whatever Slick tells you to do, you can't stop. You just do what it says. And Slick said, go ahead and get your drug of choice and get high.
If I'm feeling inadequate, if I'm feeling alone in the world, anything can trigger me. Anything can make me think that I need to use.
Relapse is really the cardinal and defining feature of addiction disorders. Patients always, with or without our help, will usually take a break from their drug use at some point, become drug-free. So they go through a period of detoxification, rehabilitation, feel that they're in pretty good shape. They may be in better physical condition they've been in a long time, highly motivated, but the difficulty is staying that way. What happens for patients with addictions is that the tendency to return is powerful.
What triggers that urge to use again when the addict already knows the hard way that using can be deadly? This question drives the research of Dr. Anna Rose Childress. Childress shows volunteer subjects videos she has made of drug-using situations. The mere sight of a hypodermic needle, or a familiar street corner, or another person using even on television can stimulate craving in the addict's brain. As her research volunteers watch the videos, Childress makes images of their brains with the new PET scan technology.
Patients describe that many of their episodes of relapse are preceded by craving state. So this work is directed towards seeing in the brain where this state occurs, and it gives you a way of rationally beginning to talk about what craving is. So what we want to do,
Anna Rose Childress is a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania's Treatment Research Center. She both studies addiction and teaches addicts how to deal with craving.
this is pretty realistic too. So
She began her work 15 years ago, using polygraph tests to indicate body changes when volunteers are exposed to cues that trigger craving.
the lighting on this is really good too. So the best we could do is to bring in a videotape that's true to life, and the way that we get a good one is by using our patients as collaborators. They tell us when we've got the right thing. This is a pretty good close-up scene.
This was